All right, everyone, welcome back to the Parking Lot Rebels. I am John, and we are talking about big tech, the First Amendment, and what happens next. So there's been an ongoing controversy lately with big tech silencing Donald Trump and his supporters on media platforms. Donald Trump, as you know, he was suspended from Twitter and Facebook a few weeks ago after the Capitol Hill riots. His right-wing supporters were quickly gotten rid of after that, including the right-wing app called Parler. Parler, of course, was eliminated from the Amazon web hosting service as well as the Apple iTunes app sites, at which point it's very difficult to have an app if you can't have a website hosted or an app on an iPhone, since we all have the iPhone. Anyways, we're looking at the New York Times article from last Friday. So from the New York Times on Friday, as Trump clashes with big tech, China's censored internet takes his side. Blurring the distinction between companies and government, official propaganda outlets use President Trump's ouster from Twitter and Facebook to argue that nobody in the world enjoys free speech. So the point of this article done by Li Wan last week is saying that there is mixed support from the population of China. On the mobile app called Weibo, I believe, in the comment section, some people are saying that the silencing of Trump is a coup, and other people are saying that nowhere in the world does free speech exist. But let's read a little bit more. After Twitter and Facebook kicked President Trump off their platforms, and his supporters began comparing his social media muzzling to Chinese censorship, the president won support from an unexpected source, China. And here's a quote: "Legally, he's still the president. This is a coup," said one comment, which included an expletive that was like 21,000 times on Weibo, the social media platform in China. "A country as big as the United States can't tolerate Trump's mouth," another popular comment said. "U.S. democracy has died." Mr. Trump's expulsion from American social media for spurring the violent crowd at the Capitol last week has consumed the Chinese internet, one of the most harshly censored forums on earth. Overwhelmingly, people who face prison for what they write are condemning what they regard as censorship everywhere. So what we're seeing here is a lot of comparisons in other countries of the locking out of the President of the United States, the sitting President of the United States, being comparable to censored countries like China and Libya. So I find it incredibly interesting to see that people under actual authoritarian regimes, like in China, are very sensitive to the idea that the president has been locked out of his own social media accounts. I think living under a regime like that is going to make you much more likely to stand up or speak out against what they see to be a slippery slope. At the same time, it's funny to see that many Americans, if not half or a majority of Americans, don't see this to be such a big deal. They see President Trump as a dangerous presence in social media, and his banning was the correct thing to do from a moral perspective. Of course, I think that's overly simplistic. This trend started with Alex Jones a few years ago, when Alex Jones is obviously a far-right personality who says extreme things that are not always correct and sometimes damaging. You have to admit that. But his banning was the first step towards where we're getting to right now. It was an infringement on free speech, and it has hurt the credibility of big tech. Of course, morality is a funny thing when you're dealing with the U.S. Constitution and law itself. Laws are designed for a reason. So the argument is the origins of the First Amendment come down to protect the citizens from the government. It's to protect us from a tyrannical government so that we are not censored when we speak out against those in charge. It's an important part of the amendment. Most of the amendments were designed to protect us from authoritarian regimes. So where people are arguing on this right now is that tech companies are not the government. The First Amendment was not designed to protect us from private companies. In fact, as you recall a few years ago with the cake shop fiasco, where a cake shop owner in Colorado refused to bake a wedding cake for a gay wedding, and people cited that as a freedom of religious observance, or a freedom of affiliation, excuse me. And so what the right wing was saying at the time was that a private company should be allowed to do what it wants, to offer you service or not. And how that relates to this is that big tech companies are private companies. Jack Dorsey owns Twitter. He can allow service to whoever he wants. So there is a logical gap there between big government tyranny and private company rights. We have to figure that out. I think that's where we're going to go next. So next up, we're looking at an article from NBC News. This is from July of this year. This is the one, I think it's a sticking point to my argument. Thousands of contracts highlight quiet ties between big tech and U.S. military. The report offers a new window into relationship between tech companies and the U.S. government, as well as important detail about why such contracts are often difficult to find. So this article talks about a study done by a private company called Tech Inquiry that looked at thousands of government contracts, trying to get to the bottom of how they tie into the tech industry. So reading the article, over the past 2 years, thousands of tech company employees have taken a stand. They do not want their labor and technical expertise to be used for projects with the military or law enforcement agencies. That doesn't surprise any of us. If we take the assumption that tech firms are mostly left-wing, they're not really keen on helping the military or law enforcement in their communities. Knowledge of such contracts, however, hasn't been easy for tech workers to come by. On Wednesday, newly published research from the technology accountability nonprofit Tech Inquiry revealed that the Department of Defense and federal law enforcement agencies, including Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the FBI, the DEA, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, have secured thousands of deals with Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Dell, IBM, Hewlett-Packard, and even Facebook that have not been previously recorded. And so the rest of this article goes on to talk about how there are probably thousands of secondary contracts, subcontracts out to these big corporations that tied into the United States federal government. And so if we're thinking about the First Amendment, if the First Amendment is meant to protect us from the government, what about private companies that work closely with the government? What about private companies that work on behalf of the government? It's no secret that Facebook is selling your information to all sorts of firms, including the federal government, for law enforcement purposes. So if Facebook itself has ties to the federal government, we have to be concerned about their ability to interrupt free speech. Here's another quote from the article. Often the high-level contract description between tech companies and the military looks very vanilla and mundane. But only when you look at the details of the contract, which you can only get through the Freedom of Information Act requests, do you see the workings of how the customization from a tech company would actually be involved. And so it goes on to say that Microsoft has 5,000 subcontracts from the Department of Defense and various other federal law enforcement agencies. And so you're seeing it here. It's not clear as day, but for people who've done the digging, they're seeing some close ties between big tech and the federal government. And it seems clear to me that if they're going to be tied this closely together, I think you can expand the concept of the First Amendment and the freedom of speech to now include these giant tech monopolies that control the social media. I think it's really interesting to me to see that people who live in actual authoritarian regimes recognize infringements on free speech when they see it. And I think many Americans do. Many people in Western civilization recognize that something's wrong with the president being locked out of their account, but they're not quite sure how to make their arguments logically. I think this is the best way to go about it. If the First Amendment is meant to protect us from tyrannical governments or authoritarian governments, we can logically expand that to include the tech companies that are working with them. If Facebook or Twitter is going to take a subcontract from the Department of Defense or ICE or anything like that, then their ability to quash free speech has to be protected against. So I don't know if that takes an expansion from the Senate or anything like that, but I think the first step is to get Americans to care about this issue. It can't just be right-wingers wanting to get Trump back online. I don't think that's your best argument, but it's unfortunate that Donald Trump made such a mess of the Capitol riot that he essentially proved all of his critics right. He went out of his way to prove that he might have authoritarian tendencies. I didn't think so a while ago, but after seeing this, I'm not really going to argue for his case. I'm not interested in that. I think he blew it. So right-wingers aren't going to like hearing that, but I think it's time to just look at it logically and say he had a pretty big hand in something that was quite bad. If you're mad about BLM riots for 7 months, you can't be happy about the Capitol riots. They're comparable. I think they're both awful. But this issue it's bigger than just Donald Trump, right? This has to be a bipartisan issue because, yeah, right-wingers are going to feel the squeeze right now, especially when you don't let them produce their own apps. If they can't have their own social media forums to talk about their ideas, I mean, that is an infringement on freedom of speech, especially when it's targeted collusion amongst several big tech firms. There's clearly ties between these firms as well as the U.S. government. They're trying to get their own, I believe they're trying to push forward the political tendencies of the majority of their staff. I don't think it's necessarily I don't think it's necessarily some sort of conspiracy by Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg to take down the president. I just think that the majority of their staff is probably left-wing, and the algorithms being written and the unconscious tendencies are coming to light. So what's happening now with Donald Trump being removed from social media, Next up, it's going to be somebody like Bernie Sanders. Once the conservatives are removed from the social media space, the next step to go will be the members on the left that are not in touch with the establishment. So if you're not on the Joe Biden program, if you're going to push back against the Joe Biden platform, they'll be the next to go. It'll be the Bernie Sanders lots. It'll be the progressives. It'll be the Kyle Kalinskis, the David Packmans. They'll be the next one pushed off of social media. Anyways, I am John with the Parking Lot Rebels, talking about the incestuous relationship between the big tech. Anyways, I am John with the Parking Lot Rebels, talking to you about the incestuous relationship between big tech and the federal government, and hopefully we're still on. It's just become clear to me that the big tech companies and their relationship with the federal government has become incestuous. They're just too closely tied together, and to treat them as separate entities no longer makes sense in terms of protecting citizens from them. It's time to start thinking about that in real terms. Anyways, I am John with the Parking Lot Rebels, talking to you about free speech and big tech companies. Come back next week for another video.